Ladies and gentlemen, we now get to have the privilege of the very first Mobile World Congress America's Fireside Chat. So welcome to the fire.
Thanks, Rod. This is a lot of pressure.
I'm going to start where I think we both think is super important. You touched on the hurricane response, and you were obviously visiting my hometown of Houston. What are your takeaways from Harvey and Irma on the progress that the industry has made and working with the FCC, how we've kind of enhanced resiliency?
I think the wireless industry has been a tremendous partner for public safety officials and for the FCC over the past couple of weeks and the past couple of years. One of the things that was remarkable when I went down to Houston is that partner after partner, state emergency officials in Austin that I spoke to, folks on the ground in Houston, others, talked about the fact that the wireless industry had been very proactive, relocating assets in advance of the storm to make sure that they could stop the disruptions as quickly as possible, making sure that they fed as much information as possible into the FCC's disaster information recovery system so that everyone could see exactly where the cell sites were down. And there are all these interesting collaborations now. For example, the governor's office in Texas is working with some of the wireless providers to provide real-time information about where some of the flooding was in the Houston area. And some of the wireless providers were able to match that with where they saw cell sites down. And they could figure out, okay, there might be people stranded here because the networks are still up and running despite the fact there's a flood. And that aided into recovery efforts. And so I think this is obviously a terrible time, but it brings out the best in both government and industry working together to try to keep people safe.
Agree, and appreciate your trip down there. I feel like from these historic, I feel like I can make a policy point out of these historic storms, and that's sort of about our next generation of networks and the small cells and how we might be even more resilient in infrastructure if we can get these guys built. What do you think?
I think that's a very keen point, and not just because the small cells are typically higher up on poles and are less obtrusive, but also because they require fiber, typically for backhaul. And one of the things I took away from my meeting with some of the state public safety officials in Austin was that fiber really is much more resilient. Both, the water pressure on copper tends to degrade its performance, and water, of course, if it comes in direct contact with copper, can degrade it permanently and immediately. Fiber is much more resilient. Additionally, the small cells, because you were able to obviously direct wireless traffic in a much smarter way, a much more redundant way, is, I think, better suited for keeping wireless communications up and running during a public safety emergency. So I think that's one of the unsung benefits of 5G that we would do well to think about as we move into the next phase of the wireless revolution.
True. In the history of the industry, we have built 150,000 towers, and in the next few years, we need to build 300,000 small cells. So we think that will be both more resilient, obviously have a faster network and have multiple benefits. We have now seen 12 states act for small cell bills, which is pretty terrific. As you noted, the FCC has everything teed up to put some guardrails and tell the states what we think and how to make sure that they get the rest of those 38 states to act. What do you think is the key for successful reform in your perspective?
I think there are a few keys. One would be making sure that we tailor the regulatory burden to the nature of the deployment. I think it seems obvious to say that the rules that would have applied to a 200-foot cell tower shouldn't necessarily apply to a small cell or distributed antenna system or other small infrastructure that in some cases you could hold in your hand. And the second thing is also to recognize that the regulatory process here has to appreciate the scale that we're talking about. It's not just a cell tower covering a sector. As you pointed out, it's hundreds, maybe even thousands of small cells, as well as the fiber that's necessary to connect those small cells to the core of the network. And so it's not enough to say, okay, we will set up a system for addressing these rules. The government has to act with speed, and that's not something that typically we're used to doing. The third thing is I think we need to make sure we prioritize US leadership in 5G. We obviously have various layers of regulatory review, federal, state, local, tribal, and obviously those regulations were put in place at a time when it made sense, of course, to have those different layers of review, but we want to make sure we preserve the public interest while also maintaining US leadership in 5G, and that's going to require careful rethink about the regulatory process.
So, you were the one that was making the link between infrastructure policy and the broadband future before anybody else was. So you were cool before anybody else was cool.
I think my wife dissents from that conclusion.
Do you think that you want to announce sweeping FCC action right here by the end of the year to make sure that we ensure US has the right tools to build out?
As eager as I would be to break news here, I have to say that we are really focused on getting it right. And we're moving as quickly as we can, of course, to make sure that we update and modernize our rules to match the realities of the modern marketplace and to enable some of the folks in this audience to continue to innovate. But it's really an exciting time, I think, for the FCC because we've teed up a lot of ideas, as you know, for streamlining our reforms. And I'm hopeful that we'll be able to move forward in due course and sometime soon.
Well, I'm game if you are. You know, by the end of the year, I think it'd be a great idea. In addition to your good high band news, I think that would be a great headliner coming out of here. But let's move. I would say from the first day of your tenure at the FCC, you recognized the need for more spectrum, and you really helped drive AWS-3 and 600 megahertz auction. What do you hope is your legacy in the spectrum policy as chairman?
I think I would hope that the legacy would be that we created a sufficient test bed for innovators of all kinds to really unleash the power of mobility. We stand on the brink of incredible innovations, and to borrow from Kevin Costner in Field of Dreams, if you build it, they will come. If you provide a test bed of innovation by getting all the spectrum, low, mid, and high band spectrum out there, there's no telling what innovative developers can create on top of that platform. And so I really hope that the FCC in a couple of years will be able to look back and say, we provided all those test beds that allow people to benefit from the mobile revolution. It's not easy to stay ahead of the curve. As much spectrum as you put out there will pretty soon be consumed, of course, by mobile consumers. And as I pointed out, U.S. Consumer data use over the last year alone has increased 34%. And that's a pretty substantial number. And especially as we get into the Internet of Things, you'll have a lot of devices coming onto the network. But I think if we stay ahead of the curve, then we can really unleash some great mobile innovation.
I agree. And the FCC has certainly made a lot of progress on low and high band in the recent years with the important things that you announced this morning, so thank you. People don't say thank you enough. Thank you.
So I hear, yes.
But I would say, I would ask maybe a little bit further about the focus on mid-band and how that kind of fits into the broader efforts.
Yeah, one of the things that I thought about when I came on board in January was the fact that we'd focused a lot of our attention on sub 3 gigahertz and above 24 gigahertz, but there was a wide swath in the middle that seemed to be in a sort of sweet spot for certain types of wireless applications. And so I asked my folks to take a comprehensive review. What bands do you think might be usable? Worked with some of our federal partners to see what could be teed up by the FCC. And I'm really pleased to say that we, as you saw in the 3.7 to 24 gigahertz notice of inquiry that we put out, that we're really open-minded. We want to see where there's an opportunity to get more spectrum out into the commercial marketplace to help the United States and foreign countries work together to make these bands commercially available. And I'm really optimistic about where things are going to go. It's a slow process, as you know, but it's better to get that started sooner rather than later. And time isn't on the side of either mobile competitors or mobile consumers.
You said it better than I did. But I commend your efforts to focus on the mid-band. I think it's going to pay true dividends in the years to come. And I think when we look at what 5G needs, these are the bands that are going to be really critical. And when we look at what other countries are doing and moving forward aggressive on, this is where they are. So that's going to lead me into, because you mentioned other countries, how much do what other nations are doing on wireless and spectrum policy, how much does that actually, how much do you track it, and how much maybe does it, how much do you watch the 5G global race?
Very closely. One of the greatest privileges of this job is to be able to meet counterparts from around the world, and it's really an honor to get to hear from them about what their marketplaces are like, what sorts of regulatory challenges they're facing, what kinds of innovations that they're pioneering so that we can learn from their example. And from India to Colombia, I've had a chance to meet with many of them, and so we work very closely together on a personal level, and our staffs, of course, do as well. We want to make sure that we are abreast of the latest developments so that we can learn from the world and perhaps share whatever best practices we've got. We're all in this together when it comes to the wireless revolution at the end of the day, and I'm hopeful that working together on a global level, we can really bring the benefits of the mobile revolution to billions of people around the world. It's, although I said earlier that I want the United States to lead in 5G innovation, at the same time, the end result is the average person is going to be better off. Lifting billions of people out of poverty is something that's within our grasp if we seize the mobile revolution. And I'm really excited about the time to come working with our foreign partners.
Love your passion. Let's bring it back to making sure that we're inclusive of everybody here in the United States.
Yeah.
I know that one of your top priorities is closing the digital divide and ensuring that all Americans can benefit from this fantastic technology and tomorrow's wireless advancements. What do you think we can do to help?
Boy, that's a good question. I think number one thing is continuing to look at ways to expand the network, to build out to places that don't have it. I mentioned the case of the woman in South Dakota, but that's not uncommon. In the thousands of miles that I've traveled on the road this past 9 months, I've seen in places like Wardensville, West Virginia, and Casper, Wyoming, that a wireless service is not what it is in the more densely populated parts of our country. And I think the wireless industry continue to do a great job by providing 4G LTE in some of those areas. And I think the Mobility Fund is one way to do that. The second thing is continue to educate the public about the benefits of the new wireless architecture. Most people, when they hear wireless network, they think, oh, okay, my phone connects with a 100-foot tower, and that's the way wireless service works. But they don't appreciate the fact that the networks are changing, that of course we're going to densification. Also the fact that the majority of wireless traffic goes along fiber, or along backhaul. And so building a public case for the greater deployment of that backhaul is absolutely critical, especially with the millions of internet-connected devices we're going to have. I think backhaul could be actually the key to those next-generation networks, and building support on a local and state and even national level for the construction of those networks is something that the industry would be squarely positioned to do. And also telling the FCC what you think about all these efforts, and if we're doing a good job or if we're not. It's important for you to give us feedback too.
So you have framed so many of your decisions and actions, and even in your speech today, about the need to jumpstart greater broadband investment and innovation. How does that inform your perspective on net neutrality and a host of other issues?
To me, it is so fundamentally critical because I see the promise of the internet in so many aspects of life that increasingly, if you want to apply for a job, if you want to get high-quality healthcare, if you want to educate your kids, if you want to start a business, if you want to do anything, the internet is essential. And in particular, mobility is essential. More people than ever are relying on their smartphones. Some people who are bored with my speech or my answers right now are probably on Twitter right now trying to figure out what else is going on in the world. This is sort of integral to everything we do now. And I think if you look at some of the studies about the power of mobility, it's an incredible. There's an economic paper from many years ago about fishermen in southern India who, once they got mobility, once they started getting access to mobile phones, their income went up because they could have price discovery among each other about the price of fish, and so they didn't have to pay an exorbitant amount to middlemen. Just one tiny example of the power of mobility to improve people's lives in one part of the world. But if you apply that powerful mobility proposition to all kinds of people around the country and around the world, there's no telling how much economic opportunity and how much prosperity we could unleash. And that's part of the reason why I focus so much on the need to set rules of the road that it will encourage greater deployment and greater investment. These are huge multi-billion-dollar investment decisions that the private industry has to make in some cases. And if the rules of the road are such that we make that business case too hard, capital will easily flow elsewhere into other sectors, into other countries. These networks don't have to be built. And that's why I focus so much on investment and deployment. I realize it's sometimes in the weeds. It's not the sexiest thing to talk about. But at the end of the day, what guarantees a better internet experience, what guarantees high-speed mobile networks is investment and deployment. And that's squarely what we're focused on.
That's right. And I can speak for our industry, of course, but we stand ready to invest $275 billion in 5G. So when you get the right policies in place, that amplifies significantly in our economy.
And that figure is even more important when you consider that the fund that I spoke about with mobility is $4.5 billion. The United States does not have unlimited federal subsidies, so we have to encourage private networks, private operators to step up, and I'm glad that you're doing it.
So I just wanted to touch on social media for just a minute, because you have such a great sense of humor, and I think that you have really used social media and your giant Reese's mug to make telecom more accessible to dozens and millions of people who would never be interested in it otherwise. How do you feel about social media impacting your job as a commissioner and now chairman?
It's had a tremendous impact, mostly good, I will say. I've been amazed how many people, whenever I meet anywhere in the country, inevitably, whatever the subject is, at the end of the meeting, someone will pull me aside and quietly say, "We thought we were going to we were going to see the mug." I had no idea this mug when I bought it in Hershey, Pennsylvania.
Yeah, where's the mug?
I know. Unfortunately, I'm left with this the simple glass of water. But by and large, it's been tremendous, both in terms of me being able to reach people who otherwise wouldn't ever get to interact with an official, and I think that's important. I take the mantle of a public servant quite seriously, and that means being as accessible as I can be and communicating my message, but it also means getting to hear from people. Obviously, you get to hear from trolls all the time. That's just part of the name of the game. But I've also gotten incredibly important feedback from people, getting to hear from people about how there was one public safety case in Texas that inspired me to lead a charge for multi-line telephone systems connecting people to 911 directly, all because of a tweet that I got. A few different things like that have informed me. And to me, at least, it's a great way of being more accessible to people. And so that's the power of the internet, honestly, is just being able to relate to people from all walks of life in a way that you couldn't in the physical world.
Now you can see why I said we are lucky to have this leader at this time. Ladies and gentlemen, Chairman Ajit Pai, thank you very much.
Oh, thank you.